And you're golden.
Okay, so as mentioned, I'm going to talk about anarchism today. And I believe some of you heard the lecture the last time I gave it. So hopefully this won't be too boring, but I have a little bit of different information that I'm going to stress this time. So hopefully it'll be okay. But to begin with, it's important to note that there are really a lot of different kinds of anarchism. And so when you meet someone who says, "Oh, I'm an anarchist," you're just going to get a lot of different ideas, and so it's hard to sometimes, like at first when I started reading anarchist literature, I didn't realize there were so many variants. So there's some variants of anarchism that I think are really great, which are the ones the main one I'm going to talk about today is Anarcho-Syndicalism. And then there are other variants of anarchism that aren't so great, at least in my opinion. So I'm, again, going to focus on the anarchism of people like Mikhail Bakunin and Adolf Fischer, for example, and Rudolph Rocker, and Noam Chomsky. So, again, to mention to begin with, there's when you just say anarchism, typically, traditionally, that's also referred to as libertarian socialism, and it is understood that anarchists are socialists. For example, Adolf Fischer, who was one of the Haymarket Square martyrs, he stated that every anarchist is a socialist, but not every socialist is an anarchist. Kind of like every Catholic is a Christian, but not every Christian is a Catholic. So socialism, of course, is a very broad term. There's many different variants, and so anarchism can be seen as one variant of socialism, namely the non-state version of socialism, in contrast to Soviet-style communism, Marxism-Leninism that advocates state socialism, where the means of production are owned by the state, largely centrally directed or centrally controlled, etc. So with anarchism or libertarian socialism, there is the idea that workers, if they don't have any control over their labor, if they have to sell their labor as wage slaves, that they are alienated from their labor, just like Marx talked in great depth about, and that is a bad situation, that a worker should be able to enjoy the fruits of the wealth that they produce and also have some control over their workplace and the decisions that are made about how they do their work, rather than having a boss in a capitalist system telling them what to do. And then also, an anarchist would say as well, that you also wouldn't want, for example, a bureaucrat to be telling you what to do. So a typical anarchist criticism of, say, the Soviet-style system is that, well, sure, this isn't a capitalist system, but instead of the manager or the boss or the capitalist telling you what to do, instead now there's a party official telling you what to do, or a manager, because everything is owned by the state. So either way, you still have a master, and you are still, to a large extent, a slave. So an anarchist would say to have what we consider to be socialism, you cannot have state control of the means of production. There has to be direct worker control or worker management of the means of production. And so an anarchist would say, instead of, again, having either a capitalist or like a Communist Party official telling the workers what to do and directing everything, instead it would be the workers through workers' councils, which you could also call, of course, Soviets, right? So there's a version of left Marxism that is largely indistinguishable from anarchism or libertarian socialism, which is also sometimes referred to as council communism. So Anton Pannekoek, if I'm saying his name right, is someone who wrote extensively about that. He's a left Marxist or a left communist, and I believe Lenin referred to that group of people as like, what's the name? He even wrote a whole book about like infantile. Sorry, let me get the phrase again. Oh dear, where is that? Okay, my notes are too small, so I'm not even having a chance to find out. So at any rate, those are the two big differences. So if you really want liberation, it has to be direct worker control. So here is, Lenin referred to this version of communism or Marxism as infantile ultra-leftism. But here is Pannekoek's description, which is much more concise and articulate than I'm being. So I'll just read it really quickly. It says, a revolutionary socialist, or in our case we would say an anarchist, denies that state ownership can end in anything other than a bureaucratic despotism. We have seen why the state cannot democratically control industry. It must be controlled by workers democratically elected directly from their own ranks, from industrial administrative committees. Socialism will be fundamentally an industrial system. Its constituencies will be of an industrial character. Those carrying on the social activity and industries of society will be directly represented in the local councils of social administration. In this way, the powers of such delegates will flow upwards from those carrying on the work, in conversant with the needs of the community. When the Central Administrative Industrial Committee meets, it will represent every phase of social activity. Hence, the capitalist political or geographical state will be replaced by the Industrial Administrative Committee of Socialism. Transition from one social revolution to the other, from one social system to the other, will be the social revolution. Now this quote is from William Paul, who was actually the founder of the British Communist Party, but who was also a left Marxist. Said, quote, "The political state throughout history has meant the government of men by ruling classes. The Republic of Socialism, however, will be the government of industry administered on behalf of the whole community. The former meant the political and economic subjugation of the many. The latter will mean the economic freedom of all. It will be there for a true democracy." So also when you think about anarchism, you just think of the literal meaning of the word, which would be like no government, right? Or society without government. So there are some people who literally advocate that, having for example, like an anarcho-capitalist who believes in having no government but a capitalist system. But with an anarcho-syndicalist or an anarchist in the sense of Bakunin, there is what you could refer to as a government, but because society is highly ordered and structured, and by way of workers' councils and different companies, they would then elect representatives to workers' councils that would be on the industry level, and then from the industry level you would elect workers to represent that industry at a societal level. And so basically you do have, in the end, a structure that has a hierarchy to it, but in which there is direct democracy, so that each person who represents the people below him has been elected by those people who are workers, and if they don't like his representation, then he's subject to recall. But by way of this new hierarchy, which is directly elected democratically, that's how you have essentially federations that would manage production, manage distribution of the surplus, and so that's how society would function. So there's not a government per se, but there is this really elaborate structure, democratically chosen, that would have to still manage, again, production, all these different things. So that does seem pretty, seem like that would be extremely inefficient, and think of all the different companies that are out there in the economy that we have. How would you have representatives from all these different people? But again, as you get higher up, there's really, especially in an advanced capitalist country like the United States, for example, most industry is essentially, or much of the economy is run and directed by a pretty small number of corporations, right? So those are kind of the key sectors of the economy are run by these very few corporations. So it's not that there would be that much, or that would be that complicated to direct that, because it's really a small number of big firms that are already doing that right now. So what anarcho-syndicalism would do is just introduce the element of democracy into the way that our economy is managed currently. If that makes sense. Another criticism of anarchism or anarcho-syndicalism is that because the idea is to have, instead of this structure or these federations that are directing society, the production and the distribution of the surplus wealth, there's the idea that these are free associations, so that there's no, again, under like a government system, that there would be force and violence used to compel people to work, for example, or do this or do that. And the idea behind an anarchist system is not to have that type of body that exerts force, ideally, to do that. And so there's the idea that these are all free, like mutual associations that people get involved in. So then the question often comes up, well, what if, say, one geographic region or the members of one particular industry say, hey, we don't really want to be part of this, big federation that's essentially directing society, these different functions that I mentioned. So we're just going to withdraw from the system and do our own thing. For example, if the example is maybe given of like the oil workers in Venezuela that were always going on strike against the Chavez government. What if everyone from the oil industry just wanted to basically withdraw from the system? That leaves everybody vulnerable because suddenly you don't have a necessary resource like oil. But again, that wouldn't be an issue because of the fact that our economy is so tightly intertwined that there isn't really a way for one specialized segment of the economy or one industry to withdraw, because of the fact that there's no way that they can be self-sufficient. So even if one group somehow controlled the oil resources, if they were to withdraw from the system, they wouldn't be able to get all of the other goods and resources and things that they need by not participating in society more broadly. And so just by the nature of these free associations, of these federations, you would again have exchange and resources moving and back and forth, and you'd have a situation where again everybody would be given the resources that they need to live, and you would abolish the wage system where of course people are only paid for working, and then any surplus that they earn, of course, is appropriated by, in the capitalist case, the owners, or in the case of more Soviet-style state communism or state socialism, it would be the surplus would be appropriated by the government. There's a couple. So with anarchists, there are quite a few that have criticized, again, Soviet-style communism in that they feel like it led to dictatorship. So the criticism would be that, well, initially the Russian Revolution started out as a popular revolution, but eventually the dictatorship of the proletariat really turned out to be just like a dictatorship. So everybody's familiar with criticisms of Stalin and other leaders, etc. So an anarchist would say, again, real liberation of workers wasn't achieved. So Emma Goldman is someone, as well as Alexander Berkman, who were both prominent anarchists in the U.S. During that same period of time. Because of their anarchist activities in the U.S., they eventually were deported to the Soviet Union after the revolution. And at first were quite excited about the developments in the Soviet Union, but when they experienced life there, they became rather disillusioned, and so this is where some of the anarchist criticisms of Soviet-style communism would come from. So they would say, again, through state control of the means of production, you just can't have real liberation of workers. And so I don't want to say Soviet-style communism isn't like real socialism or anything like that, but that version of socialism, an anarchist would say, isn't, doesn't really lead to like the type of liberation of workers that an anarchist would be looking for. The other problem is that I guess there's a difference between Marxist-Leninists and anarchists is that we do have the same goal in mind, which is communism. Obviously, everyone's familiar with the idea that socialism is a transition period after which, when there's kind of this superabundance, eventually a communist system would arise and the state would just wither away. So anarchists would say that's the wrong path to go down. To try to get to communism is to seize control of the state. A Marxist-Leninist would say, well, you need to seize control of the state because only then do you have the power to suppress your class enemies. Obviously, there's going to be reaction from the capitalist class. So if you don't control the state and the violence that you can unleash with the state, then how can you suppress those class enemies? You'll have a counter-revolution, and then you get what you got in the Paris Commune, which is all the revolutionaries get slaughtered, and you're back to square one or even farther back. So anarchists would say, well, if you do take control of the state, especially in those situations where there is reaction from the capitalist classes, a state of a condition of authoritarianism results in attempting to suppress the capitalist threat or counter-revolution. So a situation of authoritarianism develops that even if you're successful in suppressing the capitalist class and getting rid of your class enemies, well, that authoritarianism just isn't really going to go away. Once it's there, it's pretty hard to get rid of. So Martin Buber, for example, who was actually a pretty famous Jewish philosopher, but also of anarchist tendencies, said that you cannot reasonably expect a little tree that has been turned into a club, again for destroying your enemies, for that club to then sprout branches again. So that's just kind of an analogy of the way anarchists would look at that. So then the question is, if you're an anarchist, how are you going to have a revolution? That's a pretty common criticism from Marxist-Leninists as well. If you don't have a vanguard party and functioning using democratic centralism that's effective and organized and can make decisions and move quickly and essentially lead people, because the masses aren't just going to magically become organized and carry out what is necessary for a revolution, right? So you do have to have some of those more centralized features of a vanguard party in order to have the revolution be successful, and again, take control of the state, suppress your class enemies. So an anarchist would say, well, instead of that approach, again, with all the authoritarianism that can result from that, especially in the case of Russia, which was under such pressure from outside powers after the revolution, is that instead you would really have to go back to some of the original ideas about revolution, which is you can't have socialism just in one country, and you also couldn't have it in a country, like starting out only in a country like Russia, which is not kind of like the heart of the capitalist system. So if you're going to have a successful revolution, just like Lenin himself had said at times, it does need to start in the major capitalist countries like Germany, France, etc. And if you can have revolutions in multiple countries at once, that's the way to then have a successful revolution and not have, again, just socialism or a revolution in one country where then suddenly that one country is subject to attacks from all these outside capitalist countries, again, Germany, France, etc. Additionally, there are a lot of problems when you have a revolution in which the whole structure of a society is drastically changed, just due to logistical reasons. There are just certain things that are necessary in a society to have to make sure that like food gets from point A to point B where people need it, and all the different things that we need just to function. And so anytime there's a revolution, whether it's a left-wing revolution or a right-wing revolution, whatever chaos is caused during that time can have really terrible human consequences, lead to famines, a lot of people dying, and things like that. And a good example, again, from a right-wing version of this would be in Iraq in 2003. So obviously the U.S. invaded, and the Coalition Provisional Authority took power, Paul Bremer, and they tried to just totally remake Iraq into this capitalist paradise. So they abolished all of these existing institutions, the whole government essentially, and the Ba'ath Party, the army, and they had a bunch of Americans who didn't speak Arabic and didn't really know anything about Iraq trying to run the country, and you had like 22-year-old Republican kids who just graduated college that helped on some Republican campaign for Bush. Suddenly they're there like writing new rules for like an Iraqi stock exchange. And the whole thing was just this huge disaster. Obviously we would expect that's a disaster because they're trying to implement a capitalist system, but just the fact that these people were trying to make such drastic changes all at once and destroying all the existing institutions made it so that there wasn't electricity, people couldn't get their rations, medical, the health system fell apart, and there were just all these bad consequences. So even if you're trying to go from a bad system, a capitalist one, to a good system, a communist one, just that transition can be very destructive, and it seems to me that is kind of what happened in China under Mao, with all the changes that he tried to make so quickly resulted in just a lot of problems and famine and people starving and things like that. So given that is the case, with a social revolution where many of the structures stay the same, so it's instead of having, again, people from the outside, like from a party coming in to suddenly run these factories and run industry and manage production and plan it, if you have instead a situation where the same workers who are already working in those factories, working in those industries before the revolution, are also working in those same factories and industries after the revolution, only now there are no bosses, there are no capitalists, the workers themselves have taken over and are managing everything on their own, that is going to be like a better transition to the new society than having to literally, number one, destroy a lot of things, and secondly, have outside people, whether from the Communist Party or wherever, coming in and then trying just to manage the logistics of things that they hadn't been managing before. So anyways, those are some reasons why an anarcho-syndicalist method of having a revolution might be better than, say, the way that a revolution took place in the Soviet Union, for example, or in China during those periods. The last thing is, I guess, just to give some other reasons why it's useful to have a decent understanding of anarchism, even as like a Marxist-Leninist, is just because even if it is the case that anarchist organization and tactics, etc., aren't effective and would not be helpful in terms of like actually pulling off a revolution, as clearly like Leninist organizing principles were successful, to still have an understanding of anarchist ideas is helpful, because there are really abuses that you get with any kind of authority. So obviously in a capitalist system, there's the problem of private concentrated economic power, essentially in the form of corporations now, that do terrible things, obviously exploiting workers, but destroying the environment, using the state as its agent to, make sure that other countries are invaded and new markets are opened up so they can make money, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously that's an evil to have that type of concentrated authority and power in the private economic realm. There is also dangers to concentrated power in the political realm, again, which is what oftentimes can be the case under a Marxist-Leninist system. So it's important just to be aware of that idea that, hey, authority of any form can be dangerous and can be abused, and so we need to have, ideally, as much democracy as we possibly can, so that power is not so heavily concentrated in one person's hands, so that they can really abuse that power. And again, even in the case of Mao, I'm not some expert on Mao, but my impression is that it's not like he was a crazy guy who had bad intentions to go do all this bad stuff, but just because of the fact that he had so much power and was making decisions that were then implemented across the course of the entire country, which ended up being bad decisions, even though there wasn't any malintent, it seems, on his part, he had good intentions in mind, there still were pretty destructive consequences just because power was so concentrated in his hands and people followed him so much. And then again with the case of Stalin, where there was just very little criticism of what was going on in the party. If you criticize too much, then you're considered, an enemy of the people, et cetera, et cetera. And so that can then lead to, making all kinds of bad decisions if there's never any critique and criticism of what's going on that the government is doing. So, believe that will be. Let me just read. One more thing from Rudolph Rocker, who's a famous anarcho-syndicalist historian. He was a German. Just a final quote. He said, anarcho-syndicalism is not apolitical, but instead sees political and economic activity as the same. Unlike the propositions of some of its critics, anarcho-syndicalism is different from reformist union activity in that it aims to obliterate capitalism. Anarcho-syndicalism has a double aim. With tireless persistence, it must pursue betterment of the working class's current conditions without letting themselves become obsessed with this passing concern. The workers should take care to make possible and imminent the essential act of comprehensive emancipation, the expropriation of capital. So, all right, I guess go ahead and leave it at that.
Any questions?
Criticisms, Jacob, anything?
I
Can't tell if you had a dirty look on your face.
I had a few moments that I was making faces, but it wasn't to throw you off or anything like that. Would you consider the systems like? Is there a possibility of a just police system in an anarcho organized community? What would that look like in the prevention of the abuses between individuals, or is that handled in a different way than we traditionally conceive of it?
Well, I think the answer is, depending on who you talk to, would be different.
Well, certainly.
But, in my view, you could easily still have a police force, just like, the anarchists in Spain in the Civil War had militias and anarchist militias and things like that. But if you had a situation, maybe a communist would say the same thing. Once you get to a situation where there's like abundance of resources in a communist society where everybody has what they need, there's going to be like virtually no crime. Just like if you go to really wealthy neighborhoods.
So you think things like spousal abuse will disappear?
No. So I mean, there would still, in my view at least, there would still be a need for the police. Like you're always going to have like some people that, you know, for different psychological reasons commit crimes or take advantage of people or child molesters or whatever, murders. You would still have problems like that. But so in my view, you would still want to have police. But the police obviously wouldn't be serving the function that they have traditionally served, especially at a time when anarchist ideas were developing, which is the workers go on strike, the capitalist and his bosses say, or the bosses that are managing the factory for him say, oh, we'll call in the Pinkerton police and come and shoot a bunch of workers so we can get people in line again. So there would be no reason for the police to be engaged in any of those type of activities because you wouldn't have any type of, there'd only be one class, right? But there would still be, problems and crimes that people would commit. But when there's not like poverty and scarcity, you just have way less crime. So if you go to areas in the U.S. where there's, tons of poverty and everyone's super poor, clearly those are the most crime-ridden neighborhoods typically. Whereas if you go to wealthy neighborhoods where everybody has like everything that they need, then you don't need to lock your doors really. You can walk around and not even worry about it. So there would just be virtually no or very little need for police if you were able to get to an anarchist, like an anarcho-communist type society.
I think in some ways that's very insightful, but I wonder where lines specifically that you were drawing in your presentation about coercion versus, lesser forms of coercion. Because, you were talking about, say, for instance, an isolated industry kind of holding hostage from everyone else, and you were saying, well, in an anarchist society, they can't really get away with that because they're in a giant web of things. Well, I mean, there are places that people are willing to starve themselves and other people in order to do that. And a big part of the way that I understand at least some anarchist thinking works is this whole idea of liberty, right? So everything that you give up to a democratic decision, whether or not that's coercive in a very visible way versus other ways that aren't very visible, it creates a conflict. So everything you give up to, quote unquote, a democracy, a democratic decision of the people, is something that you don't have, right, the ability to enforce. Also in today's societies, right, a lot of it doesn't come down to the idea of the police coming and knocking on your door, right? It's just more subtler forms of coercion that don't actually involve the police or the executive branch of the government. So, I gave you a lot of material to work with, so feel free to pick and choose what you want.
Well, supposedly, I mean, again, who knows for sure how this might work out, but the idea is that the coercion of the government, which is the police could come and show up and, throw you in jail for not paying your taxes, that in an anarchist society that would be replaced by social norms and customs. So a lot of economic activity really isn't enforced by violence and the police and the law. A lot of economic activity and contracts and agreements that people enter into is just based on trust and relationships. And so that's how most economic activity takes place. And when you're trying to produce something and sell it or exchange it, you have to you want to be honest in your dealings if that other party is someone that you're going to encounter again. It's kind of like a game theory thing. If you encounter someone that you're never going to see again in your life and you have the opportunity to screw them over or be honest with them, there's really high incentive to screw them over. I'll never see this guy again, whatever, whereas if you are going to see him again, then there's a much higher incentive to keep your word and fulfill your end of the agreement, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how, for centuries and centuries, trade has gone on in, the Middle East is a good example during the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was only had really nominal control of most of the territory that supposedly belonged to it, but there are people that would trade and do all this stuff irrespective of what the Ottoman state was doing, just based off of relationships. So anyway, so that's how most trade actually takes place. So that would still continue without, the idea of everybody being forced to keep their agreements and things like that. Another example is, it's kind of like maybe a crass example, but it is even like the New York Stock Exchange and the different like brokerage firms that allow people to trade stocks and mutual stocks in particular through the New York Stock Exchange. There is a member organization that every brokerage firm joins called FINRA, and there's all these rules that all these brokers need to follow. And theoretically, like the SEC can get involved and like fine people and things like that. But just in order to do business and be allowed access to the exchange so your customers can actually trade and pay you for it, the commissions that they pay, like you need to obey the rules of the exchange, and there's all kinds of rules, but all brokers follow them, and there's not really any outside entity that needs to enforce that. So that's an example of like a federation where everybody knows that they need to play by the rules to have access to the system that they need to essentially, make money and do kind of what they need to do. So I don't know if that's an example.
I mean, it certainly addressed some of the things I was talking about, but...
Can you clarify the other things that I...
Well, I mean, I threw out a lot, so to be fair, it's alright if you didn't exactly
Plus, I mean,
was
if you
able
want
to zero
to
in.
repeat it, I can try to address the parts.
Well, I wanted to move on to something a little bit different, and don't worry, it's not a matter of like trying to trap you or moving the goalposts or anything like that, but do you think that anarchism in a certain sense has to favor forms and exchanges in societies or structures in society that have these sort of like unenforceable customs and things like that, which is why you see like, for instance, forms of like anarcho-primitivism and stuff like this. Not to say that, like all anarchists are anarcho-primitivism, but like if the idea is that you don't have some sort of centralized government that can like, enforce certain customs, social customs, where people play nice with one another, then you're going to create an incentive system, like you said, where, if you don't see somebody ever again, you can just totally screw them over and things like that. Because our society is the size that it is, and that people can trade information or things like that on the internet, or goods over the internet with countries far away, with people they'll never see in their life. Do you think that that's why certain forms of anarchism favor those types of societies? And do you think that there is an answer to that on a sort of like non-anarcho-primitivism sort of standpoint? And how would you think that those could be addressed? I know also that's a big, so, feel free to pick through that.
I mean, I guess the idea is for the sake of people having like their freedom, the more aspects of life that can be governed not by violence and force from the government, for example, but rather by other methods, custom, habits, social mores, etc., the better. So, I mean, there would be some like individualist anarchists who would say, who would have this huge complaint against democracy because, like, well, what if I'm in the minority and my rights are like being violated if I vote for this, but then I'm in the losing side, and so suddenly I have to go with what the majority said, For an anarcho-syndicalist, that wouldn't. I mean, like democracy is, and majority rule is kind of just. That's the way that society would have to function. That's the best you can do. It doesn't mean there's no coercion or nobody there's never any coercion, or I can always do whatever I want. There is, even again in a democratic system, there's some of that, but that is like at least the best you can do, and that's much better than having like a totalitarian system, for example, in the corporation that you work for now, for example, under a capitalist system, or with the political system as it is now, even though we can vote. I mean, as we all know, there's really a dictatorship of capital, and voting is worthless. So the more aspects of life can be governed by these non-violent ways, the better. But can you get to the point where there's never any force or any coercion? No, I don't think that's realistic,
I have a concise question now.
Okay.
It's like, so, maybe a little bit, I don't know if those other questions are unfair because they were so all over the place, but would you say that there are some forms of anarcho-syndicalism that take a democratic socialist approach as opposed to a revolutionary approach? And how would you delineate the differences between those, assuming that your answer to that question is yes?
Well, I guess I would say no, because anarchists, this was a criticism. I believe this goes back even to the first international with the disputes between Bakunin and Marx, where Marx was advocating that the different communist parties, run for parliament and form political parties to gain power, that way. And Bakunin at the time was saying, no, don't go through voting, don't go through the parliament, go through, direct action, which would be like militant unions, organizing to eventually be able to just take over, industry and have it be worker managed.
Mm-hmm.
So anarchists wouldn't take like a social democratic approach to it. Did I understand the question?
Yeah,
trying to go through, doing the things that say, again, in Germany, the Social Democratic Party, of course, was huge before the Nazis came to power. Apparently they weren't very powerful in that the Nazis were able to easily take over, but they had big numbers, but the idea of trying to get this done through parliaments and things like that wouldn't be something they would do. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, but in a certain sense, the idea is that I guess my concern is obviously in your speech you gave a sort of a warning against the sort of volunteeristic problems that can occur as a sort of a result of an immediate switch, right? And then there's also a sort of non-coercive sort of element to it as well. Those are common criticisms of anarchism, is that sometimes it just seems too voluntaristic. And I can see the virtues in which you were trying to in place that should withhold that sort of disaster. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to piece out the sort of political middle ground under which one is implementing sort of these new programs. And it's tough to piece that out. Right now we live in a society where most of the actions and interactions that people have between each one another, they're not coercive. You know what I mean? And a lot of the complaints that people have about the non-freedoms that they feel in their life are not coercive in the police sense. Certainly as organizers and good comrades of anarchists and communists, we actually do feel the sort of whip of the police and things like that. But in terms of general sort of things I feel compelled to work and all this, nobody's going to be getting a free lunch necessarily in an anarcho-syndicalist society as well. And so the real question is where is it that we're going to be engaging in programs that are different from, how is it that a transition will look if it's genuinely revolutionary but it's not also voluntaristic in some ways? You see what I'm saying?
I'm not sure I totally understand, but in terms of someone's daily life, the idea, going back to that idea of alienation of labor, if a worker is able to be creative and make his own decisions about work, of course not totally individually, it has to be among his fellow worker, his or her fellow workers, but that is going to make life and work and all these things much more fulfilling and lead to a degree of freedom that doesn't exist now. So that would be kind of the goal of like how work would change. It's not that, I'm not really sure how to answer the question of like how would people keep working if they weren't like forced to. But the work would be much more rewarding and fulfilling because they're taking an active part in it instead of just being given orders about what to do and having to just follow them. But in terms of a revolution, again, if you're able to be sufficiently organized with militant unions, syndicates, trade unions, etc., that would kind of essentially create the structure that is already in place to then take over industry once that moment of the revolution actually comes.
So let's take the example of it being a trash collector, which is a vital and necessary part of societies where even moderately sized towns are necessary. Assuming that, we don't need to naturally assume that we're in an ideal and our anarcho-syndicalist society that we'd have cities organized the way that we would. But we would have towns and villages, perhaps, where there is division of labor still being taken place, right? Well, I mean, obviously, it seems weird to me that the notion of alienation, that the way that you're using it doesn't, like, it's not a Marxist way of using the word alienation where it's literally like making it so your labor is being alienated from you and being expropriated by the capitalists. You're talking about this notion of satisfaction. But, I mean, it seems to me, there's two things I think that ought to be challenged, which is notion of, like, first of all, hedonism. Why should your life be about happiness? That seems like a weird thing. I'm not sure if anarchists are even really attached to that as an ideology, but that's something worth questioning. But the second of all is trash needs to be taken out. And who is it that we should decide that does that? Which goes back to the sort of, granted, very vague sort of attempt at getting at the problems I was pointing out with things like softer forms of coercion, right? The reason why people might have the job that they do is not because that's what they dreamed about doing when they were in kindergarten, but that's just something that needs to be done. If you take a look at people like, people that were organizing ideas about the way that we exchange things like labor or things like goods, like say for instance Adam Smith, those things might need to be divided in a way that pushes itself out organically and is not organized by happiness. Otherwise you might end up with crises like, for instance, today, right? We have a middle class of where everybody's told that they should have a job that they like for a living. And that's created a disaster in this country. We have, like, how many masters of arts, people in society that can't get jobs.
And they're not, there's certain jobs they're not willing to take. And they feel like it's below them.
Right. Well, it's not necessarily below them or below their talents or something like this, but the point is if we create the idea of making it so people only work jobs, and I know this is not what you're suggesting, but I'm saying it could follow as a consequence, as a serious consequence. If we tell people that the fulfillment and what alienation means to be in their life is that they end up doing a job that they like, then we're, how many people are pack rats that want to like have garbage in their house? I mean, they do have TV shows about it. They're sensational, but there can't be that many as trash collectors. And so we could create serious problems that way. So how would you say that the sort of anarchist soft coercion, let me rephrase that in a way that's not charitable. How would you feel like society would distribute those jobs in a way that is least coercive?
That's a good question. I mean, part of...
Because Soviets have answers for that already.
Okay. Which maybe
sometimes involves killing people.
Yeah, okay.
Trash has to go out, right?
Trash has to go out.
Yeah. It needs to be more on our
I
job.
think, to a certain extent, making people happy is not what any of this is about. I think that's something that we have as a society now, that money is supposed to make us happy and that's what we're all about as a capitalist society. I don't know if this is in any way accurate, but to a certain extent, no matter what kind of socialist society you're working in, there has to be a certain amount of esprit de corps. There has to be a certain amount of, this work is not glorious. It is not wonderful. It is not going to make you pleased with your work, but it must be done for all of us to live. And I think you can build off of that. That is something that has been very effectively used in the past and is non-coercive, because you don't force someone to do it, you simply give them pride in doing a difficult job. And that's something that's used extensively even in our society now. It's just not used in the capitalist portions of it. If you look at any organization, there's always going to be a shitty job. There's always going to be a shitty job. Sometimes there are people happy to do that job. And what you see is somebody proud of their organization and proud of their part in making it work.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Well, so what I could say is that even if you are a trash collector, you're gonna have enjoy much more freedom, and maybe that's and maybe that there is some relation to happiness there, I guess, like, because if you actually have a say in managing how trash is collected, and you're not just taking orders, but you have you're able to exert some creativity in terms of like how the whole trash system works and how your route is run, all those different things. I mean, in terms of like how do you get people to do the shitty jobs, there are different answers. I mean, if you were, say, thinking about an anarcho-communist type system where there's no such thing as wages and people are just given, according to what their needs are, then that would be like some type of a rotation type system where there's a period of time when some people, take their turn to do the shitty jobs, and it's not for their whole life, it's for like a period of time. And, in the, I'm not really sure how that would get worked out on like a nuts and bolts level of making that decision about how the rotations would work or who does it when and whatever. But that's one option. If you're not thinking of an anarcho-communist system and you're thinking more of like a, what's the actual word for it? I guess maybe even just like a collectivist system where people still are given wages, but due to like, not based on some amount of, not based on the criteria that we have now with money, et cetera, but based on like hours worked. If you have like coupons for 1 hour of labor and blah, 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 that people with the really odious, terrible jobs that are down in the sewers cleaning shit out and it smells like shit all day for them, that they do actually get like a higher
they get the CEO
reward.
salaries.
You know what I mean? They, the what?
They get the CEO salaries.
Yeah, instead of now when you have CEOs who obviously don't do any, of banks, especially financial institutions that don't do anything productive, and of course, due to the way the system is set up, they're able to appropriate obviously a huge amount of the surplus. So yeah, there would be some type of like benefit for those people who have the shitty jobs, and yeah.
Or like less hours or something.
That's the other thing too, is the idea is that if you had, if you were able to get to a communist society where there is like excess, and there's not scarcity of food, there's not scarcity of housing, there's not scarcity of all these different things, people supposedly wouldn't be working 40 hours a week. There's enough technology, there's enough industry, there's enough machines, et cetera, to produce the wealth that we need. So if it's distributed, in a communistic way where everybody just gets according to their need and there's not one group who can just basically hoard tons of the wealth, there's plenty to go around for everybody, and there just wouldn't be a need to work the type of crazy hours that we work today. So even if you are working kind of an odious job, you're working 15 hours a week, and 20 hours a week. That's a kind of a common thing that a lot of anarchists talk about. You know, again, I don't know how realistic it is, but they would say, well, in that type of a society, in an anarchist society, nobody would be working more than, you know, part-time by our standards.
I think that's an interesting way and a well thought way of trying to distribute work. The problem is, and this isn't to say this is necessarily a problem with anarchists or an anarchist system, but a problem I could see with something like this is something along the lines of, again, this coercive element, soft coercion versus this sort of like harder coercion and things like this. Because there are some people that aren't going to have any interest in working under any circumstances in, you know, the sewer system. They might not develop themselves and really just try to suck off the teat of the society, which, you know, some people might be willing to give in, but they, you know, lots of people don't feel the responsibility to help serve their brothers. But a lot of anarchists, and maybe anarcho-syndicalists don't advocate for this, but I do know that there are lots of anarchists out there that would abhor the idea of bringing upon the idea of responsibilities that one would have to their brothers or sisters.
Yeah, so that
in
would
society.
be a more individualist anarchist attitude. That
So that's
I would
not that does not square up with what you're advocating for then.
And another way to look at it is, I wish that maybe I'd had an opportunity to do this and spoke Spanish, et cetera, but from a few people I've talked to that have spent time down in Zapatista communities, my understanding is that, you know, they have what they call like good government, where, and this is different because it's pretty, you know, rural and not like huge cities we're dealing with, but basically there's like a, you know, committee that governs a particular community, and who is on that committee like changes like really often. Like I think it might even be every week or every month or something like that. So it's like if that committee makes a decision, then it gets implemented throughout the community, and I don't believe there's a choice about it. And if you want to slack and not do what you're expected to do, there'd be just, you know, probably like big social consequences, kind of like if you're someone who's always running around in public with no pants on, you know, you'll be kind of ostracized to some degree or looked down upon, or like if you're Mormon, you don't go on a mission, you know, there's these kind of like you're looked down upon. But because everybody gets a chance to participate in that good government committee, which governs the community, and that's constantly rotating, is that even if, you know, hey, you have to just eat shit sometimes and do things that you don't want to do, but, you know, you do get your chance like everybody else to be part of the people making the decisions. And so that, again, is like more freedom than you would have, you know, under like a system like we have now, where both politically you have no say, and economically your job you have no say at all. There's more freedom in that model, like a Zapatista model, than you would have now, you know. But again, I think, and maybe a lot of anarchists would disagree with me, but I know plenty of people who really would love to just sit around and watch TV all day and live off as essentially parasites, like live off of everybody else, right? That's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that CEOs are sitting around living as parasites off people, right? That's much more damaging than just some lazy friend of mine who won't work and is always asking me for $5, right? But I mean, that would be a problem, and you know, there could be some ways that people need to be coerced to work and do things and be productive. But still doing it so that everybody has a say in how decisions are made and how things work, how wealth is produced, and then how the surplus wealth is then distributed would be a good step in the right direction towards like human liberation, you know.
Yeah, just as an insight, you know, the idea to sit down and watch TV all day long might be a property of the system itself. Like the fact that that's a fantasy might come from the idea that people are worked, you know, 40 to 60 hours a week, you know, in the first place. Just like with every different type of society, the type of fantasy societies that people dream of in that society are totally different. Thomas More's utopia is different from Star Trek. Why is that? Things like this. So this whole fantasy of like watching TV, people might be interested in going outside or carving something out of wood, doing something quote unquote productive, if they didn't have to work 60 hours a week, or weren't pushed on by a system to work
True.
60 hours a week.
That's true. But then again, there are people that just
Yeah,
they
there are
just
some
love
people that
living
it's
on
just,
welfare. You know,
yeah.
they love it, and they just for generations it goes by, and just. And I've had personal friends that literally just won't work, and they just, you know, kind of make their friends all feel guilty or claim they've got this problem or that problem, and so we need to give them money and blah blah blah. I mean,
I would treat
So,
those
'cause
people
they-
like alcoholics.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
It's like we're gonna have an intervention.
So there's always gonna be problems like that, but
I wish there were more anarchists here around the table to help, because like I
Well,
find a lot of the
maybe
stuff you're
they
saying
would
is
be-
agreeable.
and maybe a lot of anarchists
It's-
would
a lot of
not
it
be
sounds
happy with
very-
what I'm articulating. You know?
A lot of it sounds very similar to the Soviet model. A lot of things about what you're talking about, like federations and stuff, they seem very similar to the structuring of Soviets.
Well, I sometimes don't.
According to like Leninism, so it's different, but there's a lot of properties that are very closely related, I would say.
Right. I mean, and my Russian history is so bad that I always like kind of get nervous, like making criticisms of the Soviet system, because like especially like say Greg is here, you know, or Jacob, because I know way more.
Yeah, it's just smoke and mirrors. I don't know a lot
But
about history.
the typical anarchist critique of the Soviet Union is it started out as a popular revolution, and workers' councils really were set up, and initially that's how the economy was going to be managed. That's why they call it the goddamn Soviet Union, workers' council, Soviets, right? But then that later degenerated into, you know, essentially a dictatorship around Stalin. So maybe that's not how really it happened, but that's the typical anarchist criticism. And so, yeah, a lot of the ideas are the same. You know, there's really is that commonality, which is why these like left Marxists or left communists, the things that they describe are like basically the same things the Anarcho-Syndicalists talk about. But then if you get an individualist anarchist, then an Anarcho-Syndicalist would have way less in common with an individualist anarchist, and of course an anarcho-capitalist, which
Yeah.
then we'd have way more in common with like a left communist or left Marxist than other you know types of anarchists. So yeah, there's tons of overlapping. You know what I mean?
And that's why I wish there were more anarchists here, because I like try to take the advocate's position, right, and be like ask questions from a sort of more of individualistic, more libertarian, socialist instead of just socialist position. Because like me and you, we can get along on all sorts of stuff, probably more stuff than not. But I would imagine that if there were some anarchists in there, they'd be like, "Well, you trying to tear me down, man?" You know, things like this. I don't know.
So, but again, there really is like, you know, I mean, I think for anarchists, there's tons of Marx that, you know, I guess I don't see any reason why as an anarchist you shouldn't have, maybe even why you shouldn't even call yourself a Marxist, but at least have like obviously very high respect for Marx, despite his battles with Bakunin. Because again, a lot of
some of
it's
them do.
just tactical, like, you know, when do you smash the state, or when, you know, do you use the state to get to communism, or do you say, well, no, that's just a bad method of getting there. So largely it's just a method or a question of tactics where they disagree, and obviously that's gotten to be, it's been a violent disagreement much of the time. All kinds of problems between anarchists and communists over the years, but there really is like tons in common. You know, I guess, you know, why do Protestants and Catholics fight so much, right? They got a lot in common, but sometimes just even the small differences are enough to cause divisions that are big enough to fight a lot, you know. Which is why if you watch South Park, you've seen the episode about the like atheist federations in the future.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So there's no religion anymore, but there's still like religion wars because there's this group of atheists that follow this guy who is the best atheist and better than this other group who follow this other atheist. Like sometimes all you need is just this one difference. That's enough for violence and to break out, whether it's just language difference, ethnic difference.
Yeah, but that's a good reason
ideological
to have soccer
difference.
games, though, not
Oh,
necessarily war.
The what?
I said that's a good reason to have soccer games, but not neccerily war.
I'm not saying these are good reasons.
Yeah, I know. I just I'm like
You know,
we
but
can work that out.
unfortunately, that can be enough. For
That is a great reason for the game of soccer.
so. Is it almost what time are we at? Is it almost 10 there?
It's getting
9:40.
close.
9:45. So.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, maybe one more if there's one.
One non me
The only
question.
comment I really made was all that I really had. So.
But if you guys, I mean, take, obviously, I'm sure everyone here does lots of reading, but if you get a chance to read some Bakunin, if you get a chance to read about the Haymarket Square Martyrs, who were primarily anarchists, those are the type of anarchists I think that you'll, probably become fond of if you take some time to do some reading. Again, Adolf Fischer, one of the Haymarket Square Martyrs. Or Bakunin or Rudolph Rocker. I think you'd probably be like, I may not agree with them on everything, but you'd respect them, So.
All right. Well, let's give him
Cool.
a hand again.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.